In the year 2000, in a small Alabama town where everyone knew everyone and secrets were supposed to stay buried, a 16-year-old girl named Tracie Hawlett and her 17-year-old best friend J.B. Beasley drove to a party on a warm summer night and never came home. Their bodies were discovered the next morning in the trunk of a car on a quiet residential street, each having been shot in the head at close range. For nearly 2 decades, their families waited for answers while the case went cold, the evidence locked away, and the town tried to forget. Then, in March 2019, a knock on a door in a neighboring state changed everything, and a name that had never appeared in the original investigation suddenly became the center of a narrative that would rock the community to its foundation. How does a case remain unsolved for 18 years, only to be cracked open by technology that did not exist when the crime occurred, leading investigators to a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along? The town of Ozark, Alabama sits in the southeastern corner of the state, nestled along the banks of the Chautauqua Creek, where it winds through Dale County before emptying into the Chattahoochee River. In the summer of 1999, Ozark was home to fewer than 15,000 people, the kind of place where Friday night football games drew crowds that filled the bleachers at Carroll Stadium, and Sunday services at the Baptist churches on Broad Street brought families together in their best clothes. The downtown area stretched along a few blocks of storefronts, some thriving, others showing the wear of economic shifts that had slowly drained vitality from small southern towns over the preceding decades. Cotton fields and pine forests surrounded the town limits, and the heat that settled over the region in July felt thick enough to touch, the kind of humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin and turned every breath into something deliberate. Tracie Jean Hawlett was 16 years old that summer, a rising junior at Carroll High School who worked part-time at a local video store and spent her free time with friends, listening to music and talking about the future. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders, a bright smile that appeared frequently in photographs from that time, and a close relationship with her mother, Carol Roberts, who described her daughter as responsible and level-headed, the kind of teenager who called if she was going to be late and who kept her promises. Tracie lived with her mother and stepfather in a modest home on the outskirts of town, and her routine that summer followed a predictable pattern of work shifts, time with friends, and preparations for the upcoming school year. J.B. Beasley, whose full name was Judith Barker Beasley, was 17, just weeks away from beginning her senior year at Northview High School across the county line in Dothan. She was tall and athletic, with a quick laugh and a reputation for loyalty to her friends. She lived with her parents in Dothan, approximately 18 miles northeast of Ozark, in a neighborhood of single-story brick homes with front yards where children played and neighbors waved to each other from their driveways. Her father worked in manufacturing, her mother kept the household running, and JB spent that summer looking forward to graduation and whatever might come after, talking with Tracie about college possibilities and jobs and the lives they might build beyond the boundaries of Dale County. The two girls had been friends for years, their bond strengthened by shared interests and the easy companionship that develops between teenagers who trust each other completely. On the evening of July 31, 1999, a Saturday, they made plans to drive to Ozark to visit a friend and possibly attend a small gathering. The weather that day had been typical for late July in southeastern Alabama, with temperatures climbing into the low 90s and the sun hanging bright and merciless in a sky that showed only scattered clouds. By evening, the heat had barely diminished, and the air still held that thick quality that made everything feel slower, heavier. Tracie picked up JB from her home in Dothan sometime after 7 in the evening, driving her black Mazda 929, a sedan that belonged to her family. The girls were in good spirits, dressed casually in the fashion of the time, and they told their parents they would be back before midnight. JB's mother, Janet Beasley, watched them drive away, the taillights disappearing down the residential street, and felt no particular concern. These were good girls, responsible girls, the kind who did not make their parents worry. The drive from Dothan to Ozark follows Highway 231 South, a route that cuts through farmland and small communities, passing beneath streetlights that grow fewer and farther between as you leave the larger town behind. The journey takes roughly 20 minutes in normal traffic, and the girls would have made it dozens of times before, familiar with every turn and landmark along the way. They arrived in Ozark around 8 in the evening, driving through the downtown area as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. What happened next would become the subject of intense investigation and speculation for nearly 2 decades. At some point during the evening, the girls stopped at a convenience store in Ozark, a detail that would later be confirmed through witness statements. They appeared to be looking for directions, asking about locations in town, though the exact nature of their inquiry remained unclear. One witness remembered seeing them, 2 teenage girls in a black sedan, leaning out the window to ask questions, their faces showing no sign of distress or fear. The interaction lasted only moments, and then they drove away, turning left onto a street that led deeper into the residential neighborhoods on the eastern side of town. Somewhere between 8:30 and 9 o'clock that evening, Tracie and JB became lost. The friend they had planned to visit lived in a subdivision that could be confusing to navigate, especially in the growing darkness, and the girls drove through streets lined with similar-looking houses, searching for the correct address. At approximately 9:15, JB called her mother from her cell phone, a technology that was still relatively new and not yet ubiquitous among teenagers. The conversation was brief. JB told her mother they were lost in Ozark, that they could not find their friend's house, and that they were trying to figure out how to get back to the main highway. Her voice sounded frustrated but not frightened, the tone of someone dealing with a minor inconvenience rather than a crisis. Janet Beasley told her daughter to find a pay phone or a store and call back with specific street names so she could provide better directions. JB agreed, said goodbye, and ended the call. It was the last time her mother heard her voice. At 9:30 that night, a resident named Marilyn Merritt was outside her home on Herring Avenue in Ozark, a quiet residential street lined with oak trees and modest single-story houses. She noticed a black car driving slowly past, making a U-turn in the cul-de-sac at the end of the street, then driving back in the opposite direction. The car moved without urgency, the headlights cutting through the darkness that had settled over the neighborhood. Marilyn watched it disappear around the corner and thought nothing more of it. Herring Avenue was the kind of street where nothing much happened, where people knew their neighbors and crime was something that occurred elsewhere, in larger cities with different problems. When Tracie did not return home by midnight, her mother began to worry. When the clock moved past 1 in the morning with no word, Carol Roberts called the Beasley household, waking Janet from an uneasy sleep. Neither family had heard from the girls. Their cell phones went unanswered. The fear that had been sitting quiet in the backs of their minds suddenly became loud and impossible to ignore. At 2 in the morning, Carol Roberts called the Ozark Police Department to report her daughter missing. At approximately 5:30 on the morning of August 1, a resident of Herring Avenue stepped outside to retrieve the Sunday newspaper from the driveway and noticed something unusual. A black Mazda sedan was parked at the curb near the end of the street, in front of a vacant lot overgrown with weeds and small trees. The car had not been there the previous afternoon, and its presence seemed out of place on the otherwise empty street. The resident walked closer, peering through the windows, and saw nothing inside the vehicle to explain why it had been abandoned. The trunk, however, was slightly ajar, not fully closed, as if someone had shut it in haste or without ensuring the latch had caught properly. The resident called the police. Officers arrived within minutes, recognizing the description of the vehicle from the missing persons report filed just hours earlier. One officer approached the trunk, gripped the handle, and lifted. Inside, curled together in the confined space, were the bodies of Tracie Hawlett and J.B. Beasley. Both had been shot in the head. The medical examiner would later determine that the wounds were contact or near-contact injuries, meaning the weapon had been placed directly against or within inches of their skulls when fired. There were no signs of a struggle inside the trunk, no defensive wounds on their hands or arms. Their clothing was intact, their purses still inside the vehicle. This was not a robbery. This was execution. The quiet Sunday morning in Ozark exploded into activity. Yellow crime scene tape went up around the entire block. Detectives from the Ozark Police Department arrived, followed shortly by investigators from the Dale County Sheriff's Office and the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. Photographers documented every inch of the scene, while forensic technicians carefully examined the vehicle, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fibers, searching for any trace evidence that might point toward the person who had done this. The trunk interior was processed with particular care, every surface examined under different wavelengths of light, every potential sample collected and cataloged. The car itself offered few immediate answers. The keys were still in the ignition. The fuel tank was nearly empty, suggesting the vehicle had been driven extensively before being abandoned. Inside the passenger compartment, investigators found the girls' belongings, their identification cards confirming what everyone already knew. On the driver's side floorboard, beneath the pedals, they discovered something that would become crucial to the investigation: a clear palm print and several fingerprints that did not match either victim. The prints were well-defined, left behind by someone who had been inside the vehicle, someone who had touched surfaces with enough pressure to leave identifiable ridge patterns in the residue of natural skin oils. Clear's throat. The autopsies were performed the following day at the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. The medical examiner confirmed that both girls had died from gunshot wounds to the head, fired from a handgun at extremely close range. The bullets had been recovered during the examination, and ballistics analysis would later determine they had been fired from the same weapon, likely a 9mm pistol, though the gun itself was never found. There was no evidence of anything else having occurred before their deaths, no signs of prolonged captivity or physical struggle. The time frame suggested they had been taken somewhere, held for a period that could have lasted minutes or hours, and then placed in the trunk and shot. Why and by whom remained terrifyingly unclear. The investigation expanded rapidly. More than 50 law enforcement personnel were assigned to the case, working in shifts that lasted around the clock. The FBI sent agents to assist, bringing additional resources and expertise in violent crimes. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation coordinated between local agencies, and the Dale County District Attorney's Office provided legal support. This was the largest criminal investigation the region had seen in years, and everyone involved understood the pressure they faced from grieving families, a frightened community, and media outlets that had descended on Ozark by the dozens. Search teams combed through the neighborhoods surrounding Herring Avenue, knocking on doors, interviewing residents, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on Saturday night. Most people had been inside their homes, watching television or preparing for bed, and had noticed nothing out of the ordinary. A few remembered hearing what might have been a car backfiring sometime around 10 or 11 o'clock, though no one could be certain of the exact time or whether the sound had actually been gunfire. In a town where hunting was common and fireworks were still being set off in the days following the 4th of July, sharp noises did not always register as cause for alarm. Investigators traced the girls' movements through the evening by interviewing everyone they had planned to visit. The friend whose house they had been searching for confirmed that the girls never arrived, never called, simply vanished somewhere between leaving Dothan and getting lost in the Ozark subdivisions. Witnesses at the convenience store where the girls had stopped were re-interviewed, asked to describe everything they remembered. The description remained consistent. 2 teenage girls, alone, asking for directions, no one else in the vehicle, no indication of distress. The crime scene on Herring Avenue was processed repeatedly over the following days. Investigators measured tire tracks in the dirt at the edge of the vacant lot, photographed shoe prints that might or might not belong to the perpetrator, and collected samples from the surrounding area. The neighborhood canvas expanded outward in concentric circles, eventually covering several square miles. Detectives interviewed sex offenders registered in Dale County, cross-referenced known violent criminals with ties to the region, and began constructing timelines and suspect lists that grew longer each day. The physical evidence from inside the Mazda was sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for analysis. The fingerprints and palm print found on the driver's side were run through every database available at the time, including the integrated automated fingerprint identification system that contained millions of prints from arrests and military service records across the country. The search came back with no matches. Whoever had left those prints had never been arrested, never served in the military, never been fingerprinted for any job or licensing requirement that would have entered their information into the system. This suggested someone with no criminal history, or someone who had been extraordinarily careful about avoiding situations that would require identification. DNA analysis in 1999 was not what it would become 2 decades later, but investigators did collect biological samples from the crime scene, including trace materials that might contain genetic information. These samples were preserved and stored, waiting for technology that could extract more information than the methods available at the time allowed. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Vigils were held at both high schools, with students and teachers gathering to remember Tracie and JB, lighting candles and sharing memories. Local churches organized prayer services. Volunteers created flyers with photographs of the girls and distributed them throughout southeastern Alabama, asking anyone with information to contact the police. A reward fund was established, eventually growing to more than $5,000, offered to anyone who could provide information leading to an arrest. The media coverage was relentless. Newspapers from Montgomery to Mobile ran front-page stories. Television news crews from stations in Dothan, Birmingham, and even Atlanta set up outside the Ozark Police Department, reporting live updates as investigators worked through the evidence. The narrative that emerged in those early reports focused on 2 innocent girls, good students from good families, who had simply gotten lost on their way to visit a friend and had somehow encountered evil in its purest form. Those who knew Tracie and JB struggled to make sense of what had happened. These were not girls who took risks, who associated with dangerous people, who put themselves in situations where violence might find them. They were ordinary teenagers doing ordinary things, and that ordinariness made their deaths even more terrifying. If this could happen to them, it could happen to anyone, to any daughter or sister who drove through town on a Saturday night. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to slow. Every lead was followed, every tip investigated, every potential suspect cleared. The fingerprints remained unmatched. The ballistics evidence pointed to a weapon that had never been recovered. Witnesses had seen the girls alive, seen them asking for directions, and then there was nothing until their bodies were discovered in the trunk. The gap between those 2 points, the hours when something terrible had occurred, remained dark and impenetrable. Detectives returned to the crime scene repeatedly, walking the streets at the same time of night the girls had been there, trying to reconstruct what might have happened. They theorized scenarios. Perhaps someone had approached the girls while they were stopped, asking for help or offering directions. Perhaps someone had flagged them down, pretending to need assistance. Perhaps the girls had encountered someone they knew, someone who seemed safe, someone they trusted enough to roll down a window or unlock a door. But theories without evidence are just stories, and the hard proof needed to build a case remained elusive. The families held funerals and tried to grieve. Carol Roberts buried her daughter in a cemetery on the outskirts of Ozark, beneath a headstone that bore Tracie's name and the dates that bracketed her too short life. Janet and Tom Beasley did the same for J.B. in Dothan, surrounded by relatives and friends who struggled to find words adequate to the moment. The high schools held memorial services before the start of the new academic year, dedicating spaces in the yearbooks to the girls who would never return to class. Investigators compiled binders full of reports, photographs, interview transcripts, and forensic analyses. The case files grew to thousands of pages, documenting every aspect of the investigation in meticulous detail. But documentation is not the same as solution, and as the first anniversary of the crime approached, the Ozark Police Department had to acknowledge what everyone already knew. The case had gone cold. Clears throat. For those who have ever watched a case slip away into unsolved files, who have seen the media attention fade and the public's memory grow dim, the years that followed were a study in frustration and helpless anger. The families of Tracie Hawlett and J.B. Beasley did not forget, could not forget, but the world around them moved forward. New crimes occurred, new investigations demanded attention, and the black Mazda on Herring Avenue became a story people told about something terrible that had happened once, a long time ago, to girls whose names some residents could no longer quite remember. Carol Roberts kept her daughter's room unchanged for years, the posters still on the walls, the clothes still in the closet, as if Tracie might walk through the door at any moment and resume the life that had been stolen from her. She attended support groups for families of crime victims, sitting in church basements with other mothers and fathers who understood the particular agony of not knowing, of having questions that no one could answer. She called the police department periodically, asking if there had been any progress, any new leads, any reason to hope. The answers were always kind but always the same. The case remained open. Investigators had not given up, but there was nothing new to report. Janet Beasley experienced something similar, the weight of unanswered questions growing heavier with each passing year. She kept photographs of J.B. throughout the house, images of her daughter laughing, smiling, frozen in moments of happiness that felt impossibly distant. She marked the anniversaries, August 1st arriving each year like a wound reopening, and she wondered what kind of person could do what had been done to two innocent girls and then simply disappear into ordinary life, carrying that secret like a stone in their pocket. The investigators who had worked the case in its early days moved on to other assignments, retired, or left law enforcement entirely. The evidence remained in storage, the fingerprints still unmatched, the DNA samples preserved in freezers that maintained constant temperatures to prevent degradation. Technology advanced slowly at first, and then with increasing speed. The Human Genome Project was completed in 2003. DNA databases expanded. New techniques emerged for extracting genetic information from smaller and more degraded samples. But without a suspect to compare the evidence against, even the most advanced technology offered little help. Ozark returned to its rhythms. Friday night football games continued. Sunday services filled the churches. New classes of students graduated from Carroll High School and Northview High School, most of them too young to remember the crime that had once dominated headlines. The black Mazda was eventually released from evidence storage and returned to the Hawlett family, who could not bear to keep it and sold it to a salvage yard. The vacant lot on Herring Avenue where the car had been found remained empty, overgrown with weeds that grew tall in the summer and died back in the winter, an accidental memorial to something most people tried not to think about. But cold cases are not truly dead, only dormant, waiting for the one piece of information or the one technological advancement that can bring them back to life. In the years following the crime, genealogical research became increasingly popular, with millions of people submitting DNA samples to private companies that promised to reveal ethnic heritage and connect distant relatives. These databases, built for recreational purposes, contained genetic information from individuals who had agreed to share their profiles publicly, allowing others to search for family connections. What most people did not anticipate was that law enforcement agencies would begin using these same databases to solve crimes, uploading DNA profiles from crime scenes and searching for partial matches that could identify suspects through their relatives. In 2018, this technique made international headlines when investigators in California used genealogical DNA to identify the person responsible for a series of attacks and homicides committed decades earlier. The method involved uploading the perpetrator's DNA profile to a public genealogical database, finding distant cousins who had submitted their own samples, and then constructing family trees that eventually narrowed down to a single suspect. The technique was controversial, raising questions about privacy and consent, but it was legal and it worked. Detectives in Ozark had followed these developments with growing interest. The DNA samples collected from the crime scene in 1999 had been preserved carefully, and advances in extraction techniques meant that genetic profiles could now be developed from materials that would have been useless 2 decades earlier. In late 2018, investigators sent the biological evidence to Paraben Nanolabs, a company specializing in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy. The company extracted a DNA profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public database used by genealogy enthusiasts. The results came back in early 2019. The profile matched several individuals in the database at varying degrees of genetic relationship, indicating distant cousins and relatives several generations removed. Paraben's team began constructing family trees, working backward from the matches to identify common ancestors, then forward through the generations to find living descendants who fit the profile of someone who would have been in southeastern Alabama in 1999. The process took weeks of painstaking research, cross-referencing birth records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and census data. The family trees converged on a single surname that appeared repeatedly in the genetic genealogy: McCraney. The investigators began narrowing the list of possibilities, looking for males who would have been adults in 1999, who had connections to Dale County, who had never been arrested, and therefore would not have fingerprints in the criminal database. The name that emerged was Coley Lewis McCraney, a man who had been 25 years old at the time of the crime and who had lived in Ozark his entire life. Clears throat. Coley McCraney had been a truck driver in 1999, employed by a local company that hauled materials throughout the region. He was married with children, lived in a modest home, and had no criminal record of any kind. His name had never appeared in the original investigation. He had never been interviewed, never been considered a suspect, never drawn any attention from law enforcement. For 18 years, he had continued living in Ozark, working, raising his family, participating in the community. To those who knew him, he was an ordinary man living an ordinary life. On March 15, 2019, investigators obtained a court order to collect a DNA sample directly from McCraney. They approached him at his workplace, explained that they were investigating the 1999 case, and requested that he provide a sample for comparison purposes. McCraney agreed without hesitation, swabbing the inside of his cheek and handing the sample to the detective. He showed no signs of nervousness, made no attempt to flee, and answered questions calmly. The sample was sent immediately to the State Forensics Laboratory for analysis. The results came back within days. The DNA profile from the crime scene matched Coley McCraney with a probability so high that the possibility of coincidence was functionally zero. This was the person who had been inside the Mazda, who had left biological evidence at the scene, who had been present when Tracie Hawlett and J.B. Beasley died. On March 16, 2019, nearly 20 years after the crime, investigators arrested Coley McCraney at his home and charged him with 2 counts of capital homicide. The news spread through Ozark like a shockwave. For those who remembered the original case, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and disbelief. For Carol Roberts and Janet Beasley, the call from investigators brought emotions too complex to articulate, a sense that justice might finally arrive, but also the reopening of wounds that had never truly healed. The families had waited 2 decades for this moment, and now that it had come, it felt both too soon and impossibly late. The media coverage was immediate and extensive. National news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the combination of old tragedy and new technology. Headlines emphasized the genealogical DNA breakthrough, the 18-year gap between crime and arrest, and the shock that rippled through a small Alabama town when a longtime resident was revealed to be a suspect in the community's most notorious unsolved case. Reporters descended on Ozark once again, filming stand-ups in front of the courthouse and interviewing residents who struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the charges he faced. Coley McCraney was held without bond in the Dale County Jail. His family maintained his innocence, insisting there had been some mistake, that the DNA evidence must have been contaminated or misinterpreted. But the forensic scientists who had analyzed the samples were certain. The genetic profile matched. The fingerprints found in the vehicle, which had been preserved for nearly 2 decades, were compared to prints taken from McCraney after his arrest. They matched as well. The evidence was overwhelming. The question that investigators now faced was not whether McCraney had been inside the vehicle, but why. What connection had he had to 2 teenage girls who, by all accounts, did not know him? What had occurred during those missing hours on the night of July 31, 1999? Detectives interviewed McCraney repeatedly, but he invoked his right to remain silent, offering no explanation, no confession, no insight into what had happened. The evidence could place him at the scene, could prove he had been inside the car, but it could not explain motive or reveal the full narrative of that night. Prosecutors began building their case, preparing for a trial that would require them to prove not just that McCraney had been present, but that he had been responsible for the deaths of 2 young women. The challenge was significant. Nearly 2 decades had passed, memories had faded, witnesses had moved or died, and the physical crime scene no longer existed in any form that could be examined. They would have to rely on the evidence collected in 1999, the DNA and fingerprint matches from 2019, and the testimony of forensic experts who could explain to a jury how genetic genealogy had led them to the defendant. The trial was scheduled for 2020, but was delayed repeatedly due to court backlogs and procedural motions. The case remained in pretrial proceedings for more than a year, with defense attorneys challenging the admissibility of the genealogical DNA evidence, arguing that the technique violated their clients' privacy and constitutional rights. Legal experts debated the issue in courtrooms and law journals, weighing the power of the new investigative tool against concerns about genetic privacy and the use of information that individuals had shared for purposes unrelated to criminal investigation. For those who have ever doubted whether justice delayed is justice denied, the wait was agonizing. Carol Roberts and Janet Beasley attended every hearing, sitting in the courtroom and watching the legal proceedings unfold with a patience born of 2 decades of waiting. They had carried the weight of their daughters' deaths for so long that a few more months or years seemed almost inconsequential, except that they were growing older, and the fear that they might not live to see a resolution was never far from their minds. The community remained divided in its response. Some residents expressed shock that someone they had known, someone who had lived among them for years, could have committed such a crime and hidden it so successfully. Others maintained skepticism, unwilling to believe that Coley McCraney, a man with no history of violence, could be responsible for something so brutal. The debate played out in coffee shops and church fellowship halls, on social media, and in letters to the local newspaper. Ozark had tried to move past the tragedy of 1999, and now it found itself confronting the possibility that the person responsible had been there all along, living an ordinary life while 2 families waited for answers. The trial finally began in April 2023, nearly 4 years after McCraney's arrest and almost 24 years after the crime. The Dale County Courthouse filled with spectators, journalists, family members, and curious residents who wanted to witness the conclusion of a case that had haunted their town for a generation. The prosecution's case was methodical and technical, built on forensic evidence and scientific testimony. Experts explained how DNA profiles are developed, how genealogical databases work, how the matches were verified through multiple independent tests. They presented the fingerprint evidence, showing the jury side-by-side comparisons of the prints from the car and the prints taken from the defendant. They called investigators who had worked the original case, now retired or gray-haired, who testified about the crime scene and the evidence collected that summer morning in 1999. The defense attempted to raise reasonable doubt, suggesting that the DNA evidence, while placing McCraney in the vehicle at some point, did not prove he had committed the homicides. They questioned the timeline, the lack of eyewitnesses, the absence of a clear motive. They pointed out that McCraney had no history of violence, no criminal record, no pattern of behavior that suggested he was capable of such acts. But the evidence was difficult to overcome. The DNA matched. The fingerprints matched. The samples had been collected before anyone knew Coley McCraney existed as a suspect, eliminating any possibility of planted evidence or investigative bias. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a verdict. On April 27, 2023, Coley Lewis McCraney was found guilty on 2 counts of capital homicide in the deaths of Tracie Hawlett and J.B. Beasley. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read, the only sound the quiet sobbing of family members who had waited nearly a quarter century for those words. The judge set a sentencing hearing for the following month, when the jury would reconvene to determine whether McCraney should face the death penalty or life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The sentencing phase brought additional testimony, this time focused on the impact of the crime and the nature of the defendant's character. Carol Roberts took the stand and spoke directly to the jury, describing the decades she had spent wondering what had happened to her daughter, the nightmares that had plagued her, the hole in her life that could never be filled. Janet Beasley did the same, her voice breaking as she talked about JB's dreams and potential, all of it stolen on a summer night when two girls got lost and encountered someone who chose violence over humanity. On May 20, 2023, the jury returned with their recommendation: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge accepted the recommendation and imposed the sentence, ensuring that Coley McCraney would spend the remainder of his life in custody. He was remanded immediately to the Alabama Department of Corrections, where he was transferred to a maximum security facility to begin serving his sentence. The case that had begun with two girls asking for directions on a Saturday night in 1999 had finally reached its conclusion in a courtroom filled with people who had never stopped searching for truth. The technology that had made the arrest possible, genetic genealogy, had proven its power to reach across decades and identify suspects who had evaded traditional investigative methods. But the victory, if it could be called that, was bittersweet by the years that had been lost and the questions that remained unanswered. McCraney never confessed, never explained why he had done what he had done, never provided the full narrative that might have helped the families understand. The DNA could prove his presence, the jury could determine his guilt, but the reasons remained locked inside a man who chose silence over confession. In the years since the trial, the case has been studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of how cold cases can be solved through advances in forensic technology. The Ozark Police Department has used the publicity to encourage other families of unsolved homicide victims to maintain hope, to preserve evidence, to trust that justice, though delayed, might still arrive. The technique that identified McCraney has been used in dozens of other cases, solving crimes that had seemed permanently beyond resolution. For Carol Roberts and Janet Beasley, the conviction brought a sense of closure that had seemed impossible for 2 decades. They could visit their daughters' graves knowing that the person responsible had been identified, tried, and convicted. They could tell the girls, in whatever way people speak to those they have lost, that justice had been served, that their lives had not been forgotten, that the truth had finally emerged from the darkness where it had hidden for so long. Clear's throat. The story of Tracie Hawlett and J.B. Beasley is a reminder that some crimes, no matter how carefully concealed, leave traces that time and technology can eventually reveal. It is a story about the persistence of families who refuse to let their daughters become statistics, about investigators who kept evidence safe even when leads ran dry, and about the power of science to illuminate truths that seemed forever lost. It is also a story about a community that had to confront the possibility that evil does not always announce itself, that sometimes it wears a familiar face and lives on a familiar street, hiding in plain sight until the day when evidence speaks louder than deception. The swing hung still in parks where children once played, just as it had on that August morning when the bodies were discovered. The toy truck lay on its side in attics and storage sheds, forgotten by families who had moved on. But Tracie and JB were not forgotten, not by their mothers, not by the investigators who had carried their case through 18 years of frustration, not by a legal system that had finally delivered the verdict their deaths demanded. Their names are carved in stone in 2 cemeteries, their photographs preserved in yearbooks and family albums, their memory carried forward by those who knew them and those who worked to ensure their story did not end in unsolved mystery. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard, waiting for the knock on the door that brings answers, waiting for science and persistence to turn the page on tragedy and write the final chapter that justice requires.